where fragmented operations leave aircraft collecting dust instead of collecting revenue. One podcast has set out to destroy downtime. This is the Death to Downtime podcast, the only podcast dedicated to aviation and aerospace tech ops professionals. Here's your host.
Thank you for coming to this week's episode of the Death to Downtime podcast. My name is Kamal, and here I'm joined today by my co-host, Mike Manier, who is also the CTO of AireXpert. Our guest today is Mohamed Bouzouba, Managing Associate at ACF Associates. With over 10 years in the aviation IT industry, he's known for driving innovative, value-added tech solutions across the industry. Mohamed, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate you making the time to have a conversation today. So, Mohamed, I know we had some questions for you and wanted to discuss a couple of topics within aviation IT. And I know you also wanted to share some questions of your own for us to have a discussion with as well. So really, we'll just have a casual discussion about some of these topics today. And if you have an introduction you want to give for yourself to get started, please feel free. We're happy to start there.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate the invite. So like Kamal mentioned, my name is Mo. For the past 12 years, really, I've been at the intersection of tech ops and IT. So I started really on the vendor side, similar to where AireXpert is now, really helping design and roll out M&E solutions at airlines around the world. I then later transitioned into a role where I was leading the IT team responsible for delivering solutions to the maintenance team at a large North American carrier, really acting as the bridge between the maintenance and the IT groups. And now I'm with a consulting organization. We really help organizations manage their fleet performance through a data-driven approach. So yeah, over the last 12 years, I've really seen firsthand how maintenance and IT succeed or stumble together.
Sure. And, I'm sure it's a lot of stumbles along the way, but to force a joint end goal working together.
Absolutely.
Of course. And Mike, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself to give the audience a little clue into who you are.
Sure. Well, it's great to see you again, Mo, and be with you, Kamal, today. I'm Mike Manier, CTO at AireXpert, and have the privilege of delivering advanced technology and integration to those users of our AireXpert platform who really are part of our focus discussion today. They're a big part of what makes air travel possible, right? The boots on the ground. Glad to be here, talk with Mo more about some of the stories and some of that technology that we just don't see that's, behind the scenes.
Works. Awesome. Thank you, Mike. So Mo, I actually thought today we'd get started with one of your questions that you had submitted for us to talk about. How is long-term technology strategy aligned with the day-to-day urgency of keeping aircraft available?
Yeah, sure. It's an interesting topic because airlines and other operators, MROs even, have, when it comes to IT, there's two things that they're trying to do, right? One is maintain the lights on with the current IT tech stack, what their solutions are, and they have resources there to support if anything goes wrong or they need bugs fixed and things like that. But there's also another part of the IT organization that's more forward looking, right? They look at long-term solutions, where the overall IT landscape is for that organization and how to make it more efficient. So I thought it was interesting to talk a little bit about how those two worlds work hand in hand to make sure that how are you prioritizing, again, keeping the lights on or forward strategic thinking or looking, right? But yeah, there are a few different ways that IT groups are set up. The most common one that I've seen in the industry is where you have both the strategic group under IT and the ones in charge of keeping the lights on. They sit in the same group responsible for supporting the maintenance organization, and their leaders report up into one leader on the IT side, right? That way you're maintaining the roadmap for forward-looking activities as well as maintaining the current tech stack. There's updates and upgrades that need to happen to just keep the lights on, right? So having one leader and one voice there to represent the IT org is a great way to keep the department in check and make sure that along with the maintenance's aspirations to look at new technology and new solutions, you're also consideration the things that maybe the maintenance folks don't see as needing to be upgraded or updated to ensure the airline can proceed, especially when you have fleet growth plans, right? Is your current IT tech stack able to stand that growth, right? Sometimes it isn't. And if it isn't, then you have to make it a priority to invest in the existing systems there to ensure that fleet growth can be achieved and not be a barrier for the maintenance folks.
Yeah, no, a follow-up question there. So, of course, you've worked with operators who have gone under tremendous growth and various times. What types of limitations did you see from the technology that may have prohibited some of that fleet growth that you did have to make a change to accommodate that growth?
And for the fleet, doesn't have enough rows in the database to store the unique tail numbers. So having to sunset old fleets and bring in new fleets and reuse of tail numbers or unique identifiers in the database is something that you would probably never think is a barrier, but it is in some cases. That's one example that I could think of.
Yeah, I was just going to comment. It sounds, again, behind the scenes, sometimes it's not that there are opinions whether something is a good idea or not to implement. There are technical constraints to consider when you're talking about the scope of any project. And again, it'd probably be interesting to hear more stories about how legacy systems do and are a reality, not only banks and other corporate environments, but how it's really impacting the airline industry in general from all sides. So is it technically possible to switch systems? These projects, they don't take weeks or months. Sometimes they take years.
If the maintenance system, as an example, isn't up and running. So yeah, making sure that the IT landscape, especially around maintenance, is up to date and can support fleet growth is super, super important and something I think we'll touch on later, definitely.
Sure. A question there, you mentioned there's these constraints you don't even think about sometimes within the IT systems to support the growth of the business. How do you explain that to someone within the maintenance departments who obviously don't have an IT background, but have a maintenance background and maybe want to grow, but can't really grow unless all these other teams are actually aligned as well? How have you navigated those situations before?
Yeah, it's a lot of communication. I think a lot of what we'll talk about today just boils down to being in sync, right? The strongest, let's say, maintenance teams are the ones that work in lockstep with IT, right? IT understands their problems and vice versa. Maintenance will understand the IT constraints. So a lot of it is about educating the maintenance folks, getting onto the same page on the constraints. And sometimes it's a matter of setting up discussions where you step through and show them the software and highlight the pressure points or the areas where it might fail, right? Yeah, there's a lot that goes into that, but definitely, I think communication is essential there and trying to explain to them what the constraints are. Because if they understand what the constraints are and also what it would take for you to make a change to the system and all the steps and approvals needed, then they're a bit more, I guess, sympathetic and understanding of it's not just an easy fix.
Sure. And I guess when maintenance and IT do misalign, where have you seen those misalignments more commonly happen? And how do you avoid them? Is it just communication for every misalignment, or is there some other strategies as well?
A great question. The majority of the time, I think it's the misalignment revolves around timeline and complexity, right? When somebody says, can I get this fixed? Or I'd like this simple change made. A lot of the time, they don't really understand what it takes on the IT side to get that change in, right? There's a lot of factors that go into it. Cybersecurity testing, you have architecture reviews, you have QA that has to come in and validate everything. Lots of different other that need to be met in order for a change to go in. So yeah, I think that's the biggest piece or the biggest misalignment when it comes to maintenance in IT is around timeline and complexity. And yeah, I think a lot of it again is around a lot of how you can resolve that is around communication and the relationship building between the maintenance folks and the IT folks, either having the IT team sit in on maintenance's steering committee meetings or having a dedicated IT leader and maintenance leader sit down weekly and discuss either roadmap items or things that are currently an issue for the maintenance team. A lot of that really helps drive understanding on the maintenance side of IT issues and helps in remedying that misalignment.
Okay. It's a very thoughtful answer. I appreciate that. A strategy that I've definitely felt has worked for me when I'm communicating these IT and maintenance relationships with folks is trying to meet them where they're at. And of course, maintenance folks understand maintenance very well. They're experts and they know what they're doing. But I often explain it like, hey, the same stress that you feel when there's an aircraft that's out of service or it's an AOG situation going on, that's the same stress that I feel when there's technology that isn't working. So there's checks and balances in place to make sure the technology is working well so that I don't have to feel the same stress that you feel in those situations. Do you feel like stuff like that would work in the conversations that you're used to having?
Yeah, definitely. I think anytime you can draw parallels between IT and maintenance and sort of find that common ground helps in explaining where you're coming from. So definitely, I think that relating on some of those key stressors would definitely help. For
Sure. Another question I did have was, so you mentioned the two things where there's often misalignment is timeline and complexity. And of course, those are very difficult things to gauge at the beginning of a project. When you're 6 months into a project, things might be completely different, right? And scope creep happens where people want more and more and more, and the requirements change of just the business world that we live in. Things happen. So I'm curious from a timeline perspective, how do you deal with those timelines changing? Because in my experience, when working with airlines, they mention, hey, this project is supposed to be complete in July. I talk to them 3 months later, and then, hey, it's supposed to be complete in December. I talk to them 3 months after that, and they'd say, hey, it's supposed to be complete in March. So that happens all the time with every airline we work with. How do you deal with those types of scope creep or timeline creep that occurs within the operation?
Yeah, and to be honest, I scratch my head in trying to think of a project that started and finished on time or even before it was due, right? It's just normal. Folks do their best in terms of estimating how long it would take to implement something, but there's always, even when applying buffer, there's always unknowns that come in that definitely extend the length of the project. But I think probably just based off of everyone's experience in the industry and implementing IT projects, there is that sort of underlying feeling where we know that it's going to slip. And so maybe there's a bit less of a expectation to hit that deadline. Sometimes if there's like a regulatory change that comes in, it's a hard deadline. Like there's no way that you can go past that. So yes, projects that would run up against that, for sure, you'd have to ensure that you either cut scope in order to make the deadline or find another way. But there's a general understanding the timeline slipping is okay as long as that project is going through. Let's say the maintenance is okay. You're telling me it's going to keep slipping, but does that mean it's going in or not? And so there has to be that level of reassurance.
In my experience, where those timelines keep slipping, it often reduces future project confidence because, of course, the past 10 projects were late. And, I've personally had to deal with that, as we're helping out operators with their projects. And they're obviously comparing us to what they've experienced in the past. And we can
Mhm.
say all the best words we can possibly say, but of course, what they've experienced is what they've experienced. And changing their minds of, hey, this one's going to be different is a challenge at times. And it obviously, words are words until they're proven. We've tried our best to actually make things as simple as possible for a lot of operators. And I think, once they start going towards the solutions, they understand, oh, this might be a little different than what I've experienced in the past. But you're absolutely right. There's that hesitancy until they start experiencing something different. They're always going to feel like this is too good to be true.
Yeah, definitely. And just to wrap up on that one, I definitely agree with you, right? The best that we could do as IT is to try and scope out and suss out how long the project is going to take by taking the beginning part of that project to really do a discovery, right? What are the data gaps that need to be filled? Are there any integration issues that need to be handled or discovered? All of that, the more time that IT can take at the beginning of a project to scope out the actual size, the better. That will give us more confidence around how long a project is going to take, right?
Hmm. Mike, in your experience, do you have any thoughts on what specific points of discovery that a team could do to ensure success?
Yeah, I think that to go along with Mo's point, the better your plan is at the beginning, the less risk that you might run into as the project moves along. But it's usually the devil you don't know about that could creep up in the start, middle, end of the project. And so I'll ask Mo this question, as the landscape grows, which hidden risks have you seen, or you can give us an example of this? What hidden risks have start to snowball, and how do you keep that complexity from impacting the success of the project?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mike. Definitely as the landscape grows, what airlines can do, I think, and what IT organizations within airlines can do is really to simplify their ecosystem, right? There's lots of solutions out there, a lot of point solutions out there, but you don't always need a point solution, right? As you're adding to the landscape, simplifying that landscape really helps. It helps with accountability, right? Especially when you don't have 15 vendors that you have to deal with on one issue, right? There's been instances where, an issue comes up, it's an issue that needs immediate attention, and you have to get multiple vendors on the line to resolve it, to find out which point in the process has it failed, right? So that's something that airlines and IT groups definitely need to think about as the landscape is expanding. We talked a little bit about older systems. The majority of the larger airlines in North America are still on mainframe systems, which is shocking to hear if you come from an IT background. That's the landscape that they're in. So as those larger carriers move forward, this is something that needs to be thought about. The other point that needs to be discussed is also process mapping, right? And this is a maintenance specific responsibility as that different processes and different ways to do things, right? Maintenance is very clever when it comes to using IT systems, right? They'll find a way to do something that there'll be 4 or 5 different ways that they complete a task, the same task, but in 4 or 5 different ways. And you're like, how is that even possible? So business process mapping and revisiting that is extremely important to make sure that people are doing the same thing. It's a maintainable, repeatable solution. So that's a really important point to make on that. And then lastly, I think people. You have to have the right people in place, the right champions in place, especially folks that are championing an IT solution, to be the voice of reason within their maintenance organization and push that change, right? If you don't have that voice, it's difficult to adopt new systems. It's difficult to adopt new processes.
You mentioned a couple things that I really resonate with. The first one being maintenance being extremely creative when it comes to IT solutions and finding new and fun ways to make it work for their day-to-day lives, even if no one else thought of those ways. I'm thinking of a friend of mine, Akeem Chase over at JetBlue. He has found a million different ways to use AireXpert to make his life easier. And, we didn't even think of most of them. So I'm really happy that people in maintenance just find a way to fix their lives to make it easier, right? Which makes sense. They're all mechanics at heart. So that does make sense. The other point you made I thought was really interesting. You could have 10, 15 different systems to actually do a single thing. I was on the phone with an operator this morning, actually, and they mentioned in maintenance control, right now they have 11 different ways to communicate information into maintenance control. Whether that's paper, that's email, that's spreadsheets, that's they have radios as well in there. It's 11 different ways they sat down and counted. And it's just a challenge of using all these generic tools, and they're all pieced together in a way that as you said, no one really thought about the process, and no one really thought about the redundancy, and no one really thought about, hey, how do we always do this as a best practice? They kind of just string together 11 different tools that everyone's going to send an email, everyone's going to send a spreadsheet, everyone's going to send paper, but then of course it gets out of hand at some point. It's a good point there. Have you seen situations like that happen very often?
Yeah, definitely. Especially, I think, in time critical areas of tech ops, right? Like you said, they have to think on their feet. There's an AOG, something needs to be done right away. And this is the trouble that sort of we fall into, is they find creative ways to use the systems to get things done. That's great. Sometimes what they're doing and the way that they go about it isn't supported, and that's the problem. But it's obvious where they're coming from. They don't want to go into that, get the IT support and get it fully, go through the process because they can do it quicker. So it needs to be, I guess, there needs to be a balance, and it's half on IT to not make the process so difficult, and half on maintenance to have a bit of patience and say, okay, well, let's think of a long-term solution. Because at the end of the day, you're going to have, like you said, 11 little systems or 11 different ways to communicate, and not one person in the organization is doing things the same way. And long-term, that's not sustainable, especially when it comes to supporting those systems from the IT perspective.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's funny that you mentioned the simple form someone creates. When someone says, hey, IT, I need you to create a simple form, what immediately goes through your mind there?
Yeah, not want to laugh right away because I've seen it so many times before, or it's asked so many times before. But you feel for them because it's, please, I just need this. It'll help my life out so much if we just made this small tweak. But sometimes the process isn't as easy as that on the IT side. Like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of different factors, considerations that need to go into making a change, whether that be, a fairly large functional change or it be a bug fix. There are different gates and approvals that need to be met in order to get that change in. That is less of an impact as if the IT system goes down and the entire fleet is grounded, right? So those are the types of, there is a reason for the approval later if a flight is canceled, right? You have disgruntled passengers, of course, but those safeguards are in place to ensure that everything is kosher with the system and there aren't any issues introduced that might jeopardize that.
I think you bring up a really good point, right? Like, as a person in IT within the aviation industry, most days are routine, normal days. And the worst case scenario is you end up in the news. And that's obviously a huge, huge, huge impact to the business, huge impact to the brand loyalty of your operator. And you want to avoid that any way possible. You're absolutely right. It's something that everyone needs to keep in mind, that sure, some IT processes might take a long time. Sometimes there's a lot of hoops to jump through, but there's absolutely a reason for that.
I've been listening. Maintenance finds creative ways to come up with solutions and get the job done. And certainly we've all seen a lot of creative ways that the maintenance organizations, those who are responsible for getting the work done with maybe less and less over the recent years, especially after the pandemic, have found those creative solutions largely due to decisions IT has made to implement platforms with flexibility, platforms that have maybe more low-code tools that could help in automation. I know Kamal and we've witnessed a lot of homegrown tools that airlines have developed to not have to go and spend possibly resources that are better well spent performing those critical maintenance and security tasks. However, there are downstream impacts for maintenance to take on those projects themselves. What do you think, Mo, is the balance there between IT enabling those maintenance organizations to maybe take more of a direct role in coming up with those creative technology solutions?
Yeah, I've seen it. I've seen that happen, Mike, definitely. You would be surprised the creativity that comes out of the maintenance organization and what someone can do who has years of experience and knows exactly how they want something tailored to their particular organization, their particular department, right? Oh, look, I've automated something that it took somebody hours, if not days to do, and for it to do automatically and in exactly, the shape and format that I need to see it, that my leadership needs to see it. Definitely. It's within the bounds and limitations that IT sets so that it can be supported. I've seen cases where through COVID or other factors, IT didn't have the bandwidth to take on some of these types of projects that maintenance wanted to do. And so it was maintenance that went ahead and built these fancy tools and apps. Flash forward, now we're the airline spending a bit more money on IT, and we're getting maintenance saying these tools aren't doing it for us anymore. And we have a bunch of issues with these tools. Can you help us? And we're in a position where we're not sure how the tools were initially built. We're not sure on the architecture and what it was meant to do, how it was meant to integrate with other systems, and how we're supposed to support it. Definitely you could fall into that trap, and it's important not to, because then maintenance can always rely on IT to come in and support. And in those cases, yes, IT has said, let's take a look and work with you and see what we can do to move you under our support umbrella, bring your code up to date, make sure that it's well supported. But yeah, there definitely is a balance that needs to be struck. I think the important thing is making sure that it's within the guardrails of the IT. Since
one part of that you mentioned there, Mo, was keeping IT involved with the roadmap to make sure that things can actually be scheduled for a time that's appropriate for both sides of the organization to work together. But of course, lots of departments, not just maintenance, are trying to work with IT on various initiatives. It could be on the revenue side, it could be on really any side of the entire operation. Airlines are a very complex business. So how does someone really effectively get on that roadmap for IT to actually support them?
So the best way that folks can push that narrative is, here's an idea I have. Let me build a business case around it. Let me make sure my maintenance leader is on board, and let that leader raise it at a forum that allows for the intake of these ideas. So that's really important, because at the end of the day, if IT needs to take that idea and pitch it and make it go through its approval processes to get it approved, they also need to develop the business case. It's really important to show the dollar impact, I would say, on how it's going to help the airline. On, let's say, the AOG side, like on maintenance, it's all about reducing aircraft delays and AOGs, ensuring aircraft uptime. So something that actually directly shows how you would save money on that side versus, let's say, abstract efficiency claims is something that's important to show, because at the end of the day, you're probably going to have to put together a return on investment presentation that shows, if we invest this money into this product or platform or solution, when will it pay dividends? When will I recoup that value on my investment? The thing that's important is also it's difficult for maintenance to actually get into this piece of it, so maybe it's less relevant, but one of the biggest barriers is obviously timeline. We've talked about that earlier. So proving that the time to implement is low enough, right? But something I guess I wanted to point out is within that business case, you also have to explain how long it's going to take to implement it and make sure that those costs are accounted for. Drafting the business case with IT really is going to help save time. So IT hears, yes, this is one of maintenance's top priorities. Let's move ahead with creating a business case. That you're working with them already on that, and making sure that it's easy to turn that around then and get it through the IT approval flow.
Yeah, part of the conversation here that has to be talked about is when an IT organization and a maintenance organization form the business case and they come together at the same table, how do they decide, or what do you think was the criteria where IT looks at the problem at hand and decides, hey, we want to create a solution in-house, or we want to buy a product off the shelf?
Good. Great question, Mike. The different factors go into it. From my experience, I think obviously time to value is a big one. How long is it going to take for you to build what you want to build versus purchasing it? So that's on one side or the other. Time to value is obviously a big piece of it. How immediate is what you're trying to solve, right? The issue you're trying to resolve or the new processes you're trying to implement, how immediate is that? Cost is obviously a big factor, right? So whether you're going to build it internally, for the most part, right, it's a one-time cost. Nowadays with SaaS solutions, the majority of those come as subscription-based. So you're going to have recurring costs if you go to purchase something, more than likely. So there's that trade-off, of course. Complexity, right? Complexity and process fits go both hand in hand. But an airline operator, MRO, can say, let's just build it in-house because we're the only airline or operator in the world that does this process in this exact way. So we can build the system to do exactly what we want it to do. Something that I've learned in the industry is every airline thinks they're unique. Process fit plays a big factor into that, because if you go to build it, you could just build it exactly how you want to build it. If you go commercial off the shelf, then you have to adapt your processes a little bit. And that ties into complexity. The more complex your processes are, or the more complex the solution you're trying to build is going to take longer. It ties into the time to value. Support is a big one, right? Generally, when you're purchasing a solution, you will purchase support along with it, or the company will offer you support, which is great to have, right? If anything goes wrong, you reach out to them, you say, hey, I need help, I need to fix it. If you build it in-house, you have to either ensure that the support remains long-term, or there's always the risk that whoever built it moves on. And then if you have an issue with it, how are you going to get support for it, right? A lot of the times, I think airlines, and it ties into what I said earlier about all airlines think they're unique. A lot of the times when they're thinking about this type of decision, it's, can we actually commercialize this solution? Can we build it and then resell it and say, well, we can actually make money on it? It depends on the market, right? If there are a lot of players in the market, then no, that's not something you're going to chase. But if there isn't one solution that fits what you're looking for and you think it's a good fit for the market, then that becomes a factor too, right? Airlines are thinking about that. Lastly, an important point that maybe some folks aren't aware of is the funding buckets that this falls under when you do build versus buy. When you build a solution, you can capitalize that. It becomes an asset, and you can capitalize it over X amount of years, and then really you're increasing shareholder value. If it's something you're buying, it's more on the OpEx side, and then you're not able to show that level of value on the shareholder side. So that's another aspect that airlines are thinking about. And I think that really summarizes all the criteria, I believe, that the airlines look at when they're trying to make that decision.
I appreciate that, Mo. A couple of things I want to deep into there. One, you mentioned building something being a one-time cost. And what we found is that a lot of airlines just don't consider support. Of course, you have to then support it over the long term. And that's something that you have to budget for. You need to have engineers on full-time staff now to support that. And they often don't think about training. Airlines don't really have training people just sitting around doing nothing to implement a new project. So that's a real cost that has to be associated with that. We found that airlines don't necessarily consider their outstations, especially when it comes to maintenance. A lot of technology that's built in-house is made for their own technicians, their own engineers, their own MOC, but the outstations are left with nothing. I'm curious on what your thoughts are when you say a one-time cost, but in reality, there are a lot of costs that airlines aren't necessarily painting into the picture for the long term, but they're just not as perceived and apparent immediately up front. So I'm curious on what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, you bring up some great points, Kamal. Definitely, those are the types of things that we talked about earlier, the discovery phase, right? When you're thinking about launching a project, these are the types of things that you would hope to have scoped out before making that decision. But definitely, you're right on the outstation side. The outstations generally, in my experience, do things a lot differently than the main line does or performs. It comes down to processes, right? Like I mentioned earlier, process fit. But yeah, definitely, it's not just a cost, and the support is probably the biggest piece of that. Training is definitely something to think about, but you can get by. I think that the support piece is the crux of that entire argument. How is this going to be supported long term? And I'm coming at it from more of an IT mindset, right? How is this in-house built solution going to be supported long term? And if there are any updates or changes, it's not just support if it goes down. It's okay, well, we change this to have new features. Oh, sorry, we don't have that capability here. It was only budgeted for the initial project launch. We don't have the developers available on hand to develop those additional features. Definitely something to think about when they're making that decision on build versus buy.
The other thing that I've always been curious about is how airline IT teams think about integrations when it comes to build versus buy. Because, of course, there's lots of systems within an airline, and you have to try to mitigate as much double entry as possible. You want to make sure that systems are talking to each other. But then we walk into an airline and none of the systems are talking to each other. And I'm curious on how these IT teams are thinking about those types of integrations that would really help the end user at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's integrations is one word that I've heard probably more in my time in the industry than any other word, right?
Sure.
That's how airlines run, really. That's how their IT landscape is built on integrations. The unfortunate part, of course, when you go to start a project, integrations are always a factor in terms of the length of the implementation of the project, because generally you're bringing in a system not to just sit alone, right? It's to integrate with the rest of the maintenance systems so that there's one direction or two direction exchange of data, right? Because that's really what's going to help with efficiency. So integrations always are one of the factors that increase a project's timeline, right? You can talk about data cleansing and things like that. Data migration is another big factor. But you find that, unfortunately, a lot of the times, because of project timelines, because of scope creep, because of projects not being completed on time, one of the first things that gets axed, unfortunately, is integration. And then it's, okay, we'll do it later. It goes on the roadmap, but gets just chucked down the line. And something that's really going to bring a lot of efficiency to the organization just gets thought of a bit later. Okay, well, we have this system in place, great. But you're really losing a lot of that efficiency and, I guess, benefit if you have a system that isn't integrated to the rest of your IT landscape, right? So that's something that's, I do find, or I have found as being an unfortunate side effect of projects taking longer than expected. But yeah, there's pros and cons to either side that you look at it for sure.
Mike, do you have any thoughts there on potentially what operators can do when integrations might seem like they're on the chopping block?
Yeah, I think it goes back to, what's the problem that we're trying to solve for and looking at the scope. Sometimes IT is requesting what's the maximum amount of features and functionality in order to secure a budget because it takes so long to secure that budget. And so they throw maybe the kitchen sink into the project plan, and it could require a significant amount of technical integration according to the project. But again, what's that core value that this project is going to solve for? And I use the 80-20 rule, right? Maybe we're focusing more on some of the features and functionality that is more in that 20% than really with the lion's share of the project solving the actual problem is in the 80%. Maybe taking another look before the whole project is at risk of not being funded. How can we focus on that 80%? And that may eliminate a lot of the aspects of the project that could just be permanent roadblocks. We are dealing with legacy systems, yes, and that could take a long time. But being creative in those solutions, there's always give and take there. I think that when in the IT organization and in the maintenance organization, when you get the right people together, that's really important. And if folks like ourselves on the call or other folks can facilitate those conversations, I think that is where it's not just an IT organization working in a silo with a maintenance organization. It's actually blending the two. We are one team. And it's not always like that. But I think over time here, that's really how we're going to have to start thinking about technology. And within the airline, especially, it should be one team, although sometimes it doesn't always feel like it.
It's a good point. Running an airline is a team sport. Everyone has to play their part and everyone has to contribute where they can and rely on others and trust others where they need to. Mohamed, I'm curious, where can maybe maintenance leaders and IT leaders really build that relationship together? How can they extend that olive branch to start building that relationship?
Yeah, I think we talked about it in one of the earlier points, but the number one facilitator to that process is communication and relationship building, right? I've had, thankfully, great experiences on my side. The IT folks were involved in the maintenance groups, steering committees. It was the heads of each of the maintenance departments and the other groups that are there to weigh in on priorities for the month, for the quarter, and they're to bounce ideas off of each other. So it helps IT understand where maintenance's head is at, what their top priorities are, where their pain points are. The topics of discussion don't always revolve around IT, but IT is always underneath. When you hear things that are going wrong or things that are causing the maintenance organization some pain, you can relate and start to propose solutions and say, hey, maybe if we did this way in the system, we could alleviate that pain. So getting that relationship formed and involving IT in those sort of leadership discussions is, I think, a key factor to success there. And also, like I had mentioned earlier, even as simple as a weekly touch point with somebody between IT and the business to talk about ongoing matters. There are some airlines where you have cross-functional teams, almost like IT testers, but that sit in the business or vice versa, right? So if the maintenance folks have any issues, they'll bring it to that team first. If that team is able to reproduce the issue or answer any questions, they're almost like first-line support. If they do find an issue with that, they can bring it to the IT group and say, hey, this is becoming an issue, this is a priority, et cetera. That type of collaboration really helps drive the relationship and ensuring that maintenance and IT are in lockstep. I think that's definitely one way that it's really paid dividends for sure.
I'm curious, one thing that we've seen time and again is, of course, especially at these really large operators, you're talking almost 1,000 aircraft in the fleet. Of course, leadership is removed by many levels within the operation. So they're not necessarily seeing the day-to-day pain points. They're seeing more of the big picture of the operation. But what we've seen some operators really be good at, very good at, honestly, is bringing in those end users early to talk to the leadership levels of both IT and for maintenance as well. Have you used that strategy at all within your conversations between leadership levels and end users?
Yeah, just a good point. And I've definitely seen that happen. Yeah, you're right in that leadership is always a few steps removed from the maintenance floor, the hangar floor. They're not going to see the day-to-day pain. And even if it gets raised up, it doesn't always make its way all the way up the chain, right? Definitely when issues end up repeating themselves consistently and it's becoming really a hindrance to someone's or a department's efficiency, that's when it gets more visibility. And those folks are then brought into those types of discussions, the steering committee meetings, and to walk through their pain points and really showcase what they're going through. Definitely.
Sure. I appreciate that. I've heard you say before, a project cannot go live successfully if the hangar floor is not involved with the project as well. What are some things that folks can really consider to make sure that they're setting their crews up for success for these projects?
The number one success factor that I've noticed when implementing a solution to the hangar floor is ensuring that you have champions on the hangar floor that are pushing the use of the application, pushing the benefits of it, pushing the increased efficiency and process changes, saying how well it's going to improve their lives. Having that person there involved in the project and being the champion for that tool or project is really key, right? That leads right into change management. You can have the best system in the world. It could save folks hours out of their daily jobs. But if you don't make sure that you have successful change management, which is training, it's making sure that they understand the benefits, it's making sure that they're aware of when go live is even happening, right? If you don't have that, then you're going to have adoption issues, right? And there's nothing worse than spending thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars on a system and a project for that tool or solution to barely be used. So I think that's a key factor in the success of a project. And the other thing is also the business processes, right? You'd be surprised actually how many airlines out there don't have a recent map of how each of their departments walks through their processes. Those things aren't updated as often as they should be. And making sure that everyone is on the same page on how a process behaved before and how it's going to behave now once you've implemented the solution is really key in that successful adoption as well.
You mentioned, and I think you got really excited when you mentioned the word super users, really championing the change. Do you have a story of a super user that you always think of in that scenario?
One that comes to mind, which is an interesting one, is the rollout of mobile execution, is something that's very prominent in the industry right now. Well, it has been for a while. It's been a buzzword, mobile execution, paperless, doing away with paper and recording maintenance either on the computer or the iPad. You need folks, especially in the maintenance space, where a lot of these folks have been around for quite a while. They're resistant to change, and just let me do it the way I've always done it because I'm good at it and I'm efficient in my own way. Rolling out a mobile solution is not as easy as it sounds to this type of demographic. So I've definitely seen in my experience getting certain users that are the champions of that solution and ensuring that, their fellow crew members are also on the same page, because at the end of the day, they still need to do their maintenance activities. They're doing an overnight check. They need to make sure that the maintenance on the aircraft is completed. They could easily just say, okay, well, I recorded it on paper, so my work is done. But it's the champions that really push them to use the mobile devices to get that work completed and really pushed a big change in the organization in moving to somewhat of a paperless solution.
So I think super users are absolutely like a part of our strategy at AireXpert. We often find that you start with the people that are going to love it the most, and then they're going to advocate for it to everyone else within the operation. That just naturally happens. But something we found really helps is making them feel like they are a part of the change. And if they feel like their ideas are being heard, if they feel like their ideas are actually being implemented while these new projects get rolled out, they feel so much more ownership for that change because, of course, change is hard for everybody. But managing that change to make it easy for people is a very important process of rolling out these new projects.
Definitely, that's a big part of change management is ensuring you have those super users and champions, and they are the ones that are driving the change, because otherwise you will definitely struggle with adoption and implementation.
That's a good point there. I appreciate that. Well, I know we're coming up on time, but Mike, you had a couple of fun questions for us to ask Mo. So if you want to get started with those, feel free.
Yeah, I was wondering, since we're talking about airlines and commercial aviation, what's your favorite place in the world to travel to?
My favorite place in the world, I've been there a few times. I pushed my wife to go back there once because I had already been, but Switzerland, specifically a region called Interlaken. It's a lake nestled in between mountains, and it's just stunning. One of my favorite places I've ever been. But yeah, I definitely feel fortunate that I've been able to travel the world based on what I've done, but definitely I keep wanting to go back to Switzerland.
Sounds like an amazing adventure, and hope to get there one day. Be fun. And to stay on that topic, as you've flown and taken commercial flights and now help airlines do what they do, what's the one thing you would or could change about commercial airline travel?
One thing I would change is making business or first class more affordable. I think I've been fortunate enough to fly in all different types of classes of travel, but when you do get to travel business on a long haul flight, it really changes you. It's a totally different experience, and it doesn't really feel like a trip, honestly. I joke because for me, the best part of the trip is the flight, right? And being able to relax, do your own thing. I'm sure airlines have to keep those seats at a certain price point because of the space that they take, but that's something that I think if it was more affordable to people, a lot more people would pay up to have that experience.
Awesome.
All right. Mo, I think the last thing that we'll ask you, is there anything that you want to mention to the audience? Is there anything that you can share of where people can find you?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn if people want to look up my name, Mohamed Bouzoubaa. I've been a nav geek since I was a young kid, so it's been a privilege of mine working in this sector, and it's not anywhere where I plan to leave anytime soon. I love the aviation industry. Thanks for having me on, guys, and appreciate the time.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Mo, for joining us today. It's been an awesome conversation. But now it's time for us to sign out, and we'll see you next time on the Death to Downtime podcast. Thank you.